Good afternoon and good after evening. Good evening. Good after evening. I'm really excited today to be moderating this session. You can't even call this shit a war, war's end, which is something that I think, did Herc say that in The Wire?
Uh,
Carver.
I can't remember. It's a long time
One,
ago.
one of them. I know, but there's all this 20th anniversary brouhaha.
Yeah.
I'm here with Kurt Schmoke, the former mayor of Baltimore City, and many things, and David Simon, who's been an incredible social commentator of our times and of my city of Baltimore, Maryland. I think it's pretty amazing. I think we're all three sitting in Baltimore. Are we all three in Baltimore? Yeah, it's an
Where
exciting
else would
thing.
we be? All roads lead.
Exactly. Different parts of town, I think, from the top to the bottom. My name is Susan Sherman. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and I've been doing harm reduction research and advocacy for the last 20 years. And I'm really honored today to be with Kurt Schmoke and David Simon. So, besides moderating the conversation, I also have the honor of introducing you both, starting with Kurt Schmoke, who's done a lot of impressive things in his life. I love that, when you read about you went to Yale, you went to Harvard, you were a Rhodes Scholar, it's always in there that you started a daycare in New Haven, which still exists, which is where Yale is. So I appreciate that. He was the dean of Howard Law School. He currently is the president of Baltimore, University of Baltimore, was a lead prosecutor in Baltimore City. But a lot of why he is here today was comments that he made when he was a three-term mayor, the first Black mayor of Baltimore City from 87 to 99, which amazes me in a city that's 60% Black. Um, and today we get to talk a little bit about decriminalization and your stance long before the time a lot of politicians were speaking out to ponder decriminalization and alternative approaches to the war on drugs. And who better to talk about that with? There are lots of people, but David Simon is a great person to have that conversation with. David Simon is an award-winning journalist, author of amazing books that were the basis of some of the most compelling television to this day, The Corner, The Wire, and Homicide. And then, of course, created lots of other created, written, produced lots of other great television series, Treme, The Plot Against America. He was a MacArthur Fellow and really is an incredible social commentary provides a lot of social commentary of our time. And it blows my mind that it's been 20 years since The Wire. So thank you so much for being here today. And thanks to International Harm Reduction Association for hosting this.
Thanks for
So
having me.
yeah, thank you. The first thing I want to ask in this short 52 minutes, Mayor Schmoke, how did you come to have your position on decriminalization, legalization, and think that, say out loud, after being a prosecutor, that there should be an alternative?
Sure. Well, I want to thank you also for your great work. They've had a tremendous impact on improving quality of life in our city, particularly women who have been exploited in our helping to lift them out of their dire situation is, I think, a real tribute for all of us. And I'm also pleased to be with David Simon. He was a tough reporter in the city where then moved into more creative being a filmmaker, but a tremendous citizen and someone and continues to make a huge impression on our city. For me, I started having questions about the war on drugs when I was the state's attorney or the chief prosecutor in Baltimore. The real turning point for me came when a friend of mine who was a officer named Marty Ward was killed in a body, and he was wearing a body wire, and I had to listen to and and listening to the guy who shot him, increasingly clear to me that the problem that we had was on drugs, but folks being hooked on drug money, and a way of addressing this that would take the profit out of distributing. Started just seeing more and more analogy to when we tried to be free America by imposing criminal penalties on the possession and sale. Just created this whole larger problem for society, prohibition, that prohibition effort. So that's from the time of death until actually I was elected mayor and had an opportunity to a group of police chiefs and mayors about it. That led me to speak to them about a different approach. I used the term decriminalization at the time. That basically got me involved, and I tell my friend generally, at least when I first got into it, I was just an ambassador for in the public sector, but I got involved my term as mayor in trying to move us towards more public health rather than a criminal justice approach to drug issues.
What did that look like? What do you mean? I mean, there are lots of questions. One is how people react to your saying that. But the first, I'm curious, what do you mean? How did that look like in your, when you were mayor, trying to make that shift?
Well, remember, yes, some of the things that we did right now in 2022 are, people, but in 1988, when I first made considered decriminalization of drugs, the initial reaction class was that I was crazy, by many others, that I ought to be impeached. God, those, where the train station is, please be under it. So a lot of a very, very strong reaction. But one of the having not only understanding or being the Ethan Nadelman, but I had two wonderful public health health commissioners in Baltimore who felt very strongly that we ought to look at some of the models in Europe, in particular in the Netherlands, because we had a twin city relation, and then look at Portugal, some of the things going on there. What I began to understand, and looking at the problem, was what was considered the drug problem in America was not just crime, it was AIDS, and those matters, you can't arrest your way out of an addiction, your way out of the AIDS issue. So we started implementing public health strategies that are now, we were the first city to get a needle exchange program in the United States, drug treatment.
And we just health department needle exchange program. Sorry, first health department needle exchange. First needle exchange program from a health department. Yeah, Baltimore.
You would know, Susan. So
sorry, Dave Perch was the first. I thought in harm reduction, but yeah, you were the first with Peter Bielenson.
Yeah. So we implement harm reduction strategies, but it was also during the country when crime issues national scene. So we ended up with this federal legislation in the Crime Act of 1994 that eventually in the 2000s understand that it was increasing mass incarceration without helping communities. But so a different time frame. I was 99, and but there started to be major new century.
Did people, so to talk a little bit both about the reaction when you made the comment, like we should look at alternatives and mention decriminalization. It's hard to imagine, you know, in 1988, how astounding that was to come from, and bold that was. Still it's bold, and we wish people could stand up and say that and call it for what it is, that this war is never going to be won, and there's so many casualties along the way that it's just kind of an incredible societal cost. What were people's reaction? Did that resonate and change hearts and minds of policymakers, or how did people in Baltimore and elsewhere react to your saying that? Because you said it in a national setting.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things that I learned was, you know, the importance. Governor Cuomo, the first Governor Cuomo, Mario, used to say that the officials must distinguish between ideas that sound good and ideas. And when I raised the issue of I had no initial support for that being a sound idea. Although sessional leaders did hold the hearing eventually on the question, it made it sound like they were just doing this under duress. Really no serious discussion here about that. It took a long time. Fortunately for me, I had a 4-year term, and when I ran for re-election, all the polls showed that still disagreed with me, but they gave me credit for opinion, not altering it, and so they kind of shifted the burden to my. Well, we know where Schmoke is on this. Where are you? And they just heard them lock them up, throw away the key approach. And so I was able to, again, working with our health commissioners, implement some approaches to the complex issues of addiction and crime.
So speaking of crime, because I mean, you were so before your time, and sadly, after you were mayor, the subsequent mayor really lock them up, arrest people sitting on a corner was unfortunately caused a lot of havoc in our city that we continue to pay the price for, with the unbelievable murder rate. Say again. Well, that's right. Yep. That's what were you going to say?
I said destroy the police department.
Right, destroyed the police department. What do you mean by that? How?
Well, I mean, you know, rightly so. Most people look at the drug war and wonder whether or not it's going to make communities or addiction, it's going to have a meaningful effect, negative or positive, on the citizenry. But there's something counterintuitive about what we did with the drug war, which is that when you train police to sweep the streets, to emphasize mass arrest, to credit a drug arrest, as meaningless as it is in a city like Baltimore, as being meaningful police work, you're also training a generation of police how not to do the things that you really need police to do, which is there's a whole skill set about how to properly suppress and investigate crime and pull up case files and make felony cases and make the city safer. And it has nothing to do with drug enforcement. And that disassociation occurred. And so when Mr. Schmoke was mayor, he had a clearance rate in the homicide unit of say 70%, which means probably about 40% of those who took a human life were receiving some sanction, going to prison for some time, when it all shook out in court. By the time we went through that stark period of mass arrests in the early aughts, and we trained the next generation of police now how not to do police work, but how to fight the drug war. The clearance rate for most felonies had been cut almost in half, and murder certainly in half. And the number of people going to jail for taking a human life in Baltimore fell to about 10%, maybe 15 in the courthouse. So we made the city more dangerous. And that's sort of counterintuitive because we were taught, my God, these addicts, they're such a fundamental threat to public safety. You need to lock people up. You need to lock drug dealers up. But in truth, what we needed to do is lock the people up who were harming people. And that requires a police skill set that we destroyed. And it happened over about 20, 30 years. But your chance of being arrested for doing something really harmful in Baltimore with a gun to another human being, that deterrent has collapsed, and you can directly credit the drug war.
And I think, obviously we're still living the impact of that. And it not only, I mean, you talked about it ruined the police, but also eroded community. Community have such an important role in keeping their neighborhoods safe. They know what's best and who's around. But why would you trust this force that locked up so many young men and really created havoc? So that is, can you talk a little bit about that, like in the work that you did?
At the height of Mr. O'Malley, the successor to Mr. Schmoke, at the height of his running for governor, the city of Baltimore locked up 100,000 people, a city of 620,000 at the time, setting a record. Most of those arrests were not legal. They were dismissed right at the jail doors. It was a very cynical act. It was eventually the city had to stop it after a successful ACLU suit was settled. But ultimately, what it was doing was saying we're an army of occupation, and nobody talks to an army of occupation. When I was in the homicide unit to write a book, the same year that Mr. Schmoke, raised the specter of drug war not being viable. There was the detectives would complain that the phone didn't ring the same way it used to with tips, that people didn't call in when there was a murder at the same rate, that there was a growing silence. 10 years later, those same detectives wished for the rate of community involvement in 1988, because by the time you got done, or 20 years later rather, by the time you got done drug warring, police were not regarded as a viable deterrent to what, I mean, here's the bottom line. Is West Baltimore and East Baltimore, or our most vulnerable communities, are they over-policed or under-policed? And the answer is both. They're over-policed on that which should not matter, which does not involve crimes against persons or people's personal safety in any real way. And they're grossly under-policed when it comes to taking the shooters away who are terrorizing these neighborhoods. And so that is the Baltimore of today. And that, you get a lot of people who want to argue the one on either side of that, but will not acknowledge the other. And they're linked. And that makes it hard for people who are, prison abolitionists or defund the police. It makes them hard for them to deal with the other side of the equation, and people who are back the blue and they're not acknowledging the damage done to community trust.
No, it's unfortunately indicative of the huge divide in this country now, where people can't even have conversations. And these terms are so polarized. Once you mention defund the police or fund the blue, it's almost like a door shutting to a conversation.
And they're unequivocal terms. They're 100% one way or the other, and all of them contribute to an inability to grapple with the real context of the problem.
Right, I agree.
So one of the things that I did find kind of community does, people began to listen to the notion that you could approach the drug issue in a different way. I cited often to audiences that were always very skeptical and very concerned about the relations with the police. But these three questions, I would say, do you think we've won the war on drugs? Currently winning the war on drugs? Do you think that doing more of the same will win? I said, if you can't answer in the positive way to those three questions, alternatives. And people generally would. They would say, hey, no, we're not winning. We can't. Team's not going to win. What's the alternative? That's when you get an opportunity to start things like the needle exchange or expanding treatment and moving. Or I guess the basic principle that I was trying to was that if we're going to have a war on drugs, it should be a public health war. And over time, people started to, and I think that showed some in our community.
Well, really, I mean, I want to go back to one thing. I appreciate your kind of keep coming back to public health and having these kind of responses that are central to addressing this issue. And really, it's a war on poverty. I mean, I hate that war terminology, but there are all sorts of things, precursors to, why are people not just public health, but poverty, isolation, desperation. You drive through neighborhoods in Baltimore City. Sadly, they don't look much different, many of them, than when The Wire was filmed 20 years ago in Southwest and West Baltimore. I mean, things haven't changed. And so I think part of the issue is back to this polarization is you don't ask the right questions about why these things exist, and then you're not going to provide the right solutions. I'm curious, Mayor Schmoke, when you were mayor, how, we just talked about the police a bit, and there's so much more to talk about with the police. How did they react to your shift in thinking about crime and what the role of the police in fighting the drug war or the, decriminalization?
It was actually a mixed reaction. Most people thought that this was a crime problem that could be addressed in police and courts. The more that I talked about it, I started hearing the police leadership knew that this wasn't the best approach. We had to do more things to reduce the as I said, what I thought was an initial time, I saw a great deal of change in leaders in the police department wanting more drug treatment around, more jails. So it was an interesting.
How did that impact? Because oftentimes, like any organization, there's a big difference, and definitely with police in Baltimore and elsewhere, the leadership and how they feel is very different than what happens in the instant you have that interaction with the beat cop, with the cop who's on the street. How are they, you only talked about, how is that? How are police on the street?
I would, let me defend that, because he probably talked to more guys on the street than I was kind of the command staff.
Well, half and half. Some of them saw it and said to me bluntly, not as early as '88 when you first came out. You were, in 1988, a prophet without honor to a lot of cops. But by the time I started working on The Corner, or planning the book The Corner, which was more of a tract about the drug war than violence, a lot of the police that had become my best sources and I thought were the smartest investigators, they were saying that you were right. Not everybody. There were people who still wanted to fight the war to the nth degree, but a lot of cops came around, and something there was an inevitable problem in that when police were in the midst of their career, they wouldn't speak openly to their cynicism about the drug war. When they got to the end of their career and looked back, they could be blunt as hell. And one of the great drug warriors in modern Baltimore history, Bishop Robinson, who was a police commissioner and then went all the way to Secretary of Public Safety in Maryland, and then ran the prisons. I had a lot of long talks with him after after he retired, and he had built a lot of prisons and he'd filled a lot of prisons, and he had fought the drug war from the time from 1951, I think he came on the department, and he said that that was a mistake. That was a strategic disaster, from step A to step Z, and he was unequivocal about it. But of course, we were sitting over a table at Delicios. We weren't, he wasn't at a press. So that is the nature of how people are vested in status quo. And I really credit you, because when you came out and said it, I was in the homicide unit at the time to write my first book, and I had real grave doubts about the drug war, but I did not think I would ever hear it expressed in a public forum. And I remember being a little bit shocked when it came out. I think that was the nature of the response in the police department. But 10, 15, 20 years later, no one's shocked. The language stands to the reality.
Susan, I also got invited to the Army War College to speak about this issue. Not only folks from the military, but they were training people and the FBI, and then a number of officers from countries around the world that were involved in drug trafficking. And strongest responses that I got to my state, military guys who said they had lost friends fighting and they would say to me, "Mayor Schmoke, are you saying that my buddy in vain for that?" And trying to get over that aspect of it, and trying to say that this problem's more. I respect what you're doing, but the strategy is, and that was tough. But I heard a lot of that, and so I started to also text say that, in my view, the war on drugs was our domestic Vietnam. That got a strong reaction from some. Others understood what I was, the guys that fought there, but the strategy there was wrong.
Totally right. Right. And that resonated more with people
over time. Getting invited back to the War College, I don't know whether it was part of the
oh no, that's a good indication. It's a good indication. Well, the other piece is everybody, it's hard when you get a paycheck, when your buddy gets a paycheck, when you risk your life every day to critique the system that upholds all of that. I mean, we have such numerous industrial complexes from the war on drugs, a lot private prisons, public prisons, the coffers of politicians. It's really hard to extricate that. But if you think about, it's always interesting to me, and I'm curious what you both have to say. Cops have family members who have been addicted and who have lost their lives. And a lot of them grew up in neighborhoods where they got in their heart where this was wrong. How did those conversations do you ever have those conversations with police? Because people are impacted in so many ways, especially now.
I mean, I have. I know police who've had addiction in their families, and it's heartbreaking, as it always is, and it can send them in either direction. They can either become more committed to the war on drugs, or they can reflect on it. What Mr. Schmoke is saying is absolutely right, which is there's a delicacy to telling people that what they've been doing, sometimes for their entire career, might be a losing effort. That it might not be achieving the goals that were strategically claimed for it. And this goes right back to Marty Ward, the death of the undercover detective that you that spurred your thinking. I was out there that night in December of '84 in front of the Candy Kitchen, and I watched Gary Childs and other police who knew Marty, and I knew Marty a little bit, breaking down at his death. And And I remember thinking at the time, I mean, I remember that case was going after a couple people who were supposed to get them to a very large trafficker, a decently large trafficker, Ghost Cane. And it, whether it did or I think it did or it didn't, but I remember Ghost Cane eventually getting 30 years.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself, I can't tell this to Gary Childs or to anybody who's a police and who knew Marty, but it's not worth it. Getting this one guy who's eminently replaceable as a drug trafficker, his 30 years federal as a sentence is not worth the life of Marty Ward, a very good man. And there, it's a hard thing to say. For 3 years, a former Baltimore city homicide detective who was teaching at the FBI Academy in Quantico had me come in and talk about policing drug-saturated communities. And I would basically make a long, elaborate argument to these in-service training classes in Quantico that in order to police the communities, concentrate on violence, ignore the drugs. You know, ignore the drugs, focus on violence. If you can parlay somebody's drug involvement into actual information, I guess in this environment you'll do that. But if you're making drug arrests to make drug arrests, you're not helping anyone, and you're not doing police work. And that gig lasted for about 3 years until I ticked off so many police that it was time to go home. But you know,
Which is so interesting because in many communities, we did some work with police on trying to understand their great impact on women who sell sex on the streets of Baltimore, and we did a lot of ride-alongs with them. They all said you can't arrest your way out of the problem. At community meetings, they say that like beat cops are beaten and put in harm's way. And I think a lot of people get that they can't do the work that they're intended to do. And they go to work and they're hated, and it's understandable. But it's just really, it feels so ridiculous. You said that in 88. Is that when you made that statement, Mayor Schmoke?
1988.
It's 2022. How are we still having this conversation? And I mean that not as just rhetorical. Why do you think we're still having this conversation, Mayor Schmoke?
Well, I think one word is politics, but it comes from a real push level. You know, the conversation about substance abuse changed at the local level mainly because of OxyContin. I mean, they start talking about fentanyl and stuff, who's addicted, and it's those people. It's not, you know, how the government to respond is a little bit different. They don't want their next door neighbor to go. They want treatment. So the discussion about the war on drugs has changed, and you can see it just from the votes about medical marijuana. That's changed. That's state and local, but at the national level, it is still let's deal with the drug dealers and the statistics and the incarceration. I mean, the fact that marijuana is still designated as a Schedule 1 just lets you know that we're still dealing with national politics driven more by politics than science.
Right.
So really the biggest impediment to fundamental change.
No, I think you're right. It's a ship that never wants to turn.
although to be slightly optimistic, I think it's probably turned more in the last 15 years than it has. And I think in some respects, Mr. Schmoke's right about synthetic opiates because it reached into the white community in a very big way. Suddenly, the notion of a draconian war on drugs became less tenable. Now, that cuts two ways because actually synthetic opiates are probably the most dangerous in terms of the rate of overdose and the rate of death.
Yeah.
Fentanyl particularly. So it's a double-edged sword. And if you're trying to convince people to embrace the idea of this as a health problem and to remove the enforcement arm, they look at they look at people who are bringing fentanyl into the country or producing it here, and they say, how can you allow that? How can you not fight that? And the
Not an
truth is,
either or. It's not an either or.
I think it is actually. I mean, I'm actually a little bit further than that, which is to say, I do believe that to decriminalize this and to really launch it as a public health war, we have to abandon the notion that there can be any contraband that we're going to interdict. Or, I mean, I think ultimately what we have to do is admit that if we're going to actually do what we say we're going to do and make this a medical issue, then ultimately we have to do that. And we have to ultimately say, in a fundamental way, we're going to see more overdose deaths. We're going to see more tragedy. We are going to see, I mean, listen, when Prohibition ended, more people died of drink than in any other generation happened in America. There is a cost to decriminalization. We have to admit it. But the cost to not doing it is to basically turn one America against the other, to make these very vulnerable neighborhoods in our cities into free fire zones, to make people who are living there pay so much more of the cost. Of
the
what
taxes. That's right.
Yeah,
I guess I meant. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying, I'm not without understanding that there is a cost to decriminalizing drugs, because some of them genuinely are dangerous and they will have a negative effect. But doing what we're doing is reaching levels of violence that are, I think, unsustainable for cities in some cases.
Well, I completely agree. I think why I said it's not an either or, people that still focus, like, play the same tune, we need to go after the big guy. I mean, what happened, what happened when sad story, Oxycontin, lots of it from, drug distributors, illicit pharmaceutical companies. Then we had policy that basically said, we can't have that anymore. So then there was a booming heroin market. Interdiction, really tough on heroin, not as much heroin can come into the country. Well, people that produce drugs are really clever. Let's, create something that's smaller quantity, bigger street value, fentanyl. So
exactly. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt, but you cannot convince me there's a drug dealer big enough that I have to come off this unwillingness to prosecute anymore until you put the Sacklers in jail. And since that hasn't happened, and since we're still arguing about how much of their money and how much of their billions they're willing to relinquish for the pain caused, and since they're not exposed to any criminality, I think it's really hard pressed to say that there's some other drug trafficker that the government needs to prioritize. It's a cynical.
I think you're right. And it begs this question. I mean, like you said, you started this bit by talking about the fact that, like, until it was at people's doorstep, when all of these, kids, and I mean, it's a stereotype, but it's true. There are kids in high school, you have an injury, all of a sudden you're used to get behavioral therapy or, get whatever. And insurance not only pays for OxyContin. I mean, the insurance companies are also somebody that nobody ever talks about their role in what they paid for. They were paying for all of this Oxy, and then it stopped, but they won't pay for drug treatments. So the system in general, I think, is really broken, and it's a lot easier to, ignore neighborhoods. People in Baltimore, where I live, where my kids go to school, when they hear what I do, they're almost shocked. I'm like, it's 5 blocks over on Greenmount from my daughter's school,
Right.
but people live in a very divided world and don't really care if that war is not happening in their neighborhood or their community's not taxed. Not that they don't care, but they don't feel it. So anyway, people are interested to hear what you have to say, not what I have to say. But I think that it's,
I agree
really,
with that.
yeah, it's just unbelievable what it takes for something to really change. I want to ask you, I think it's fascinating to go to The Wire. I think it's really interesting that it still resonates so greatly for people. So, and I'm sure you've done a lot of press and talked to a lot of people about the fact that it's its 20th year anniversary since the beginning of The Wire. What kinds of conversations are you having about the content?
It depends on with who. I mean, in some respects, The Wire was about the drug war. That was where it was framed. But it was really, I mean, there was sort of a theme that we were trying to keep hold of throughout the entirety of the piece. That was about why it is that we've lost our capacity to problem solve as a society. That we can't even acknowledge the scope of our problems, much less solve any of them. And our political dynamic, our body politic, has become oh God, what's the word I'm looking for? The arteries are clogged. We are, I mean, the legislative function of our national government is clogged with money. I mean, you could even say that in some ways the presidency is still the presidency. In fact, maybe it's more the imperial presidency. The judiciary is still, for what it's worth, the judiciary, but the legislature represents an inertia and a almost a calcification of our self-governance and that's what we were really trying to write about, is that basically everybody, whether they were the cops or the corner boys, they were in a rigged game, and until you basically change the terms of engagement and what the strategic, and you admit to yourself what is a plausible goal and what isn't, nothing good is happening. So I think in some weird way, everybody feels that about our world right now. I think it anticipated. We were writing, yes, about the drug trade in Baltimore, but we were reading about, at the time we started reading about Enron or the Catholic Church and their inability to police, sexual abuse. Right. We were talking about systems and where systems become calcified and intransigent and self-preserving. And that was, we're not libertarians. We need these systems. We need schools. We need
work.
We
Right.
need government. Demonizing them is all fun and games, but at the end of the day, you got to send your kids somewhere to learn, and you got to you got to enforce those laws that are really elemental. So it wasn't a libertarian track, but it did touch on a lot of anger and frustration that people were beginning to feel, even back in, even 20 years ago, about why we weren't attending to our own problems as we once at least attempted to do. There was never consensus. There was, self-governance is hard. What's the line from Churchill? Democracy is the worst form of government until you consider all the alternatives. Right. And that's true. And it will always be true. And democracy can never be perfected. It can't be won. It can't be won completely. It can be lost completely. And so that's where we were standing, and we were really, it was an angry show, but it was pretty deliberate. And I think that stuff has stayed with us even more so, looking at what our problems with self-governance are right now. I don't know. That's the conversation we were trying to have. I think right now, it doesn't matter who you are, if you're conservative, liberal, libertarian, Republican, Democrat, abolitionist, back the blue, no matter what you seize upon some part of that show and you say, see, this proves my point. But they never seize on all of it. They just,
which is the brilliance of the show.
They just, this character said this one thing and I agree with that. So this show,
right.
But then this other character said something and they got that wrong, That's where it is.
Right. No, it's really amazing.
How the show resonated around the world, because I got to do an article for the Guardian paper in Great Britain, Baltimore to the Wire. They wanted to compare the real Baltimore to the Wire, and it was in the first 4. I think it was 4 that they asked me to do that, but I was just amazed at how popular in Great Britain.
I will say this, Mr. Schmoke allowed us the great inside joke of making him the health commissioner for Baltimore City, who basically tells the mayor that if he tries to decriminalize drugs, he'll be called the most dangerous man in America, which is I believe that was Charlie Rang threw that one on you. Am I right?
Right.
But he allowed us the great inside joke that probably the best inside joke we had in 5 years. So thank you for that.
And also,
Thanks
you
for
gave out
inviting.
syringes. You approved syringe service programs, right? On the wire, I feel like that, or Amsterdam. I can't remember, but you were
It was part
involved
of
in something.
Amsterdam. Yeah, we tried to have Amsterdam serviced by harm reduction
Right.
and from needle exchange to trying to intake for those people who wanted to get off the corner. And I mean, yeah, we did that, and we did that in awareness of what had been attempted in Baltimore City and was still being undertaken, and talking with Pete Bielenson and other people, and we were proud to do it.
Mayor Schmoke, it was, one of the reasons I didn't mean to correct you earlier, but why it was so amazing that the syringe service program was the first city sponsored is because the other syringe service programs were started by amazing individuals who had great courage out of systems and did it illegally. So it's a real tribute to you and Peter Bielenson and the people that started the needle exchange in Baltimore City when you all did in 1994, that had never been done by a public health department. And I'm curious,
The
I'm
other
leading. Yeah,
interesting thing about that, because it's consistent with the conversation we had earlier about intransigence of it. It took 4 years, from the time that we first proposed, because there was a state law that a waiver of that state law relating to who could distribute needles, and we ran into roadblock after roadblock. We were able to get the support of the religious communities down to Annapolis, along with the police chief of Rotterdam, a number of others, and then the Governor Schaefer's Secretary of Health, the governor, to send the signal that he wouldn't veto the bill. He indicated he would veto any bill that allowed this. But so we got, with a very giving us the waiver for a 4-year program. Then when how effective it was, we got everybody except for one legislator over. So, I was pleased that applied research does have an impact in the way public policy goes.
Yeah, no, you worked with Dr. David Lahav, who did an amazing job with his team.
Right.
And of course, it's great that you collaborated with lots of different entities, including researchers, to do good science to make a point. So the last time we talked a few years ago was about overdose prevention sites. And I think this year will be the 6th year it's been introduced to the state legislature. Getting out of committee sometimes, really depending on the election year, it goes so far or has support. So I'd love to hear, because in a lot of ways, besides drug checking, that's really the harm reduction hotbed of this time, is overdose prevention sites in the US. Of course, lots of people who are listening now are like, it's a part of their public health system. I'd love to just hear your thoughts about it and the politics of why it's so political. Yeah.
There's an awful lot of misunderstanding, and it's so easy to demonize it politically, to say this is running up the white flag and declaring a retreat in the war on drugs. The sites symbolize retreat, that this is still over, and it is people listening to easy political science. So it's going to take a while to build up in support of these ideas.
Do you have any thoughts about that, David Simon, about overdose prevention sites? You really documented many illegal overdose prevention sites.
Well, more necessary than ever given fentanyl. Yeah, I mean, first do no harm, and
Yeah.
try to save the lives you can. I have here's something that I actually admired when I was in the homicide unit in Baltimore. I went out on a lot of overdoses because you're called to these unattended deaths, and people want to they need to make sure it is what it is. And I never saw any detective on any shift ever attempt to write up a case against anybody who tried to call in, anybody who was firing drugs, who tried to call in and call 911 and say, I got a guy here and he's fallen out, and yeah, we just fired heroin, or we've shot a speedball. They never charged a guy. They never charged him. They knew inherently, and this goes back to 1988. They knew inherently and professionally that the moment they started charging people criminally for firing drugs, or for being for obtaining drugs with other people, they were going to get more bodies rolled up in rugs or dumped in dumpsters. People were not going to cooperate. It's that same dynamic of, are you trying to be an army of occupation, or are you trying to police a community? And believe it or not, those who are addicted are part of that community. They're still human lives. So in Baltimore, that was not that. There was a standard. We do not do that. We want you to call 911. We want a chance to throw some Narcan in a guy and maybe save his life. I had occasion about 5 years ago. Somebody I knew was with somebody in New York who was firing drugs, or not firing. They were snorting, and she overdosed. And it was in somebody's apartment, and the person in the apartment said, I realize I'm being anecdotal, but I think it's a tell, and I think there's a metaphor here. The person in the apartment said, "Get her out of here," demanded that she be removed. He didn't want anything to do with it. My friend basically had to help carry her down to the vestibule of the building in New York. But then he used his own cell phone to call the police, to call 911 and ask for help. And then he waited for the paramedics to get there. He didn't leave her. And the U.S. attorney charged him and put him in prison. And I thought to myself, I even wrote the sentencing judge, I wrote, I've covered this for a lot of years. Where is the sense of what you're doing and about the humanity involved? Because, this is a sure signal to people who are in that culture that they need that they can't interpose humanely. And in some ways, the political stance of the drug war leads us to these very dark moments where we do the exact wrong thing.
Right.
By means
drug-induced homicides.
Yeah, and I mean,
107,000 people died of overdose last year, and we
right.
are around, and we're like charging people to basically make a citizen's call, be a good Samaritan. Yeah,
and this was the office. It was astonishing to me. This was the office of a very center-left Democratic U.S. attorney who brought the case. It probably didn't help that the victim was attractive and white and female, and that the defendants were African American, and that it had publicity in the tabloids in New York. But I don't care. Ultimately, we're responsible for how we, for the humanity of our decisions. And it's amazing to me that we're not simply saying, win or lose, can we save a life here?
I feel really remiss in the last 2 minutes that we haven't even talked about the racist overtone of this war that's been waged in U.S. cities and largely impacted, whites and blacks in the U.S. use same amounts of drugs. The footprint of the criminal justice system is so deep in primarily not only, but African-American inner city communities. How do we tease apart systems that uphold racism like this? And when racism is so alive and well in our culture right now, racism is so part and parcel of this incarceral mentality. How do you disentangle that? I don't know if that question made sense, but you can't talk about the war on drugs without talking about racism.
Well, it gets a little complicated, though. And when you think back at the crime bill before, it had huge support from the Congressional Black Caucus. That, from my experience as mayor at the time, that most of us were saying, please give us more police. not more drugs. It was only after the impact of this mass incarceration be seen that the comments, the views started changing, and so you could get more focused on the race issue. But in the early 1990s, there wasn't from even the African American or any other community of color about there. I mean, some on the difference between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine, but generally a critique of the war on drugs as a racist thing was the major message coming from any of the communities. And so people started to see the stark differences, and have heard from President Nixon's chief domestic policy guy. Reasons that they pushed the war on drugs was because they thought it was a way with controlling the black community.
Exactly. I mean, I think in some respects you don't try to separate it. You try to basically tag it permanently as being, listen, the first anti-drug statutes in this country were anti-Chinese immigrant in the 1880s. Right. The yellow peril of opium. It is look, the drug war is a function of fear. It operates and it metastasizes because it works for politicians as an operation that requires and savors the fear of the body politic. So what better fear is there in America than that of the othered race? From the very origins of the drug war. If you're trying to get people scared and you're trying to get them to vote out of fear, then every 2 or 4 years, what can work better than, oh my God, these terrible drugs, they're endemic to this other community of people who are not like you, and they're coming for your kids.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty potent political, a raw political message. And I think the only way you avoid, or the only way you just demystify that is by talking about it overtly, by saying, this is what you're doing. You did it before. You did it in 94 when you passed that omnibus crime bill. You did it back. You've always done it. And, the more you talk about it, I think the more people come around to being like, I'm not going to be fooled and I'm not going to be afraid. Maybe not all of them. Maybe there's always new people to be fooled. You can't fool some of the people some of the time.
Right. I think you're right. I mean, sadly, those tactics still work, right? People coming over the border, the murderers. I mean, someone just won an election and numbered not so in our recent past for same fear tactics. But
dope on the table. Dope on the table. Look at all the drugs we seized at the border. Is that good or bad? I mean, you're saying it because apparently they seized at the border. Is that, I mean, like the hilarity of, my God, this current administration grabbed all these drugs. This is awful. Well,
it's a quick fix, actually. That's just a quick fix. I mean, like a quick, of course, there are always drugs on the table. And in the, your medicine chests and whatever. I want to thank you both so much. I am really honored to talk to you all. You've done so much for this city that someone once said to me, Baltimore needs a lot of love. And I feel like you shine the light on the strength and courage. And also just like, there's a lot Baltimore has to fight against. And it's an important city to be known and see. Because once we close our eyes on cities like Baltimore, we're screwed.
I think the person who's done more for the city is Mr. Schmoke. I think if you talk to the Greater Baltimore Committee, they would say, "Can you do a little less?" when they get to me and
all depends on your perspective.
I mean no harm. I'm trying to say what I have to say. Sorry.
And telling a story. Yeah. Do you want to say any last words, Mayor Schmoke? I really appreciate.
No, I that we had someone that was going to say goodbye. Maybe I
misunderstood. Naomi Berkshine, that's right. So thank you both. Now we're going to hear from Naomi Berkshine, who's the Executive Director of International Harm Reduction Association, and bringing this time to a close.
Thank you so much, Professor Sherman. You've done a spectacular job with this conversation. And to Mayor Schmoke, David, we really, really appreciate having you here. I think I speak for everybody when I say I think we could have gone on for another hour listening to your conversation. So thank you so much. David, a couple hours ago on Twitter, you hinted at foam and spittle, which is a tantalizing twist. And I think given—
I wasn't referring to you. That was what's been going on in my feed for the last 4 days.
No, I think given that tantalizing twist, I think we have been incredibly sound and evidence-based. It's been fantastic to have this this discussion. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of our 2-day Constellations Fest 2022. That was so much fun. I really enjoyed that conversation. But I'm really blown away by all the sessions of the past 2 days. At the beginning of Constellations, we suggested a theme of bravery, ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of crisis. And over the past 2 days, from Uganda to Ukraine to the Philippines, we have seen community leaders, service providers, lawyers, policy wonks, activists, each of them stepping up every day. And that is not easy. I feel very grateful to be within the drug policy reform movement and the harm reduction movement, because I think we are an incredibly supportive group. We're about seeing each other and holding each other up. And I suppose that is one major reason why we come together, like we have done at Constellations, to confirm our connection, to ensure we can continue showing up, being brave, and to bolster our resilience, so we can continue to try to change things for the better. Because this can be exhausting and exposing work. And it's quite ironic when you think of it, because all we're saying is pay a bit of attention to the science and could you be a bit more compassionate? But it is exhausting and exposing work. So thank you to our delegates, everybody who showed up the past 2 days to actually make this a convening, to come together with us. Thank you to all of our brilliant speakers who worked across time zones in their 7th language with various Wi-Fi capacity to really bring a motivating and really inspiring conversation to us over the past 2 days. It goes without saying, thank you to Ethifarm for making this possible, and to the genius minds behind it all, Lucy O'Hare and Maddie O'Hare. Thank you so much for your curating power and making this happen. So that is it from my perspective. The one last thing to mention, we are having Harm Reduction International, the conference in person in Melbourne in April 2023. We would like to get together in person. It's been a long time coming. We have abstracts closing not on Friday. We have just extended the deadline until Monday. So get your abstracts in because we want to come together in person. Thank you. Have a good night.